Welcome and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. Sleep. It's one of those things we love to have, but many of us seem to suffer from sleep apnea or one thing or another that doesn't allow us to go into the dream worlds. And what about staying asleep once you do, that time when you kind of jolt in the middle of the night and find yourself laying there for another few hours wondering if it's ever going to come back to you? Joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program today is someone who has spent nearly 30 years studying and researching sleep and ways that we can actually use the assistance of technology to help us sleep better. Basically, figure out ways that we can change our sleeping patterns and feel more restful in the morning. I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today a person who co-founded the School of Clinical Polysomnography, which is an interesting term in and of itself, nearly 2 decades ago, and he became a university professor of sleep health and sleep technology at the Oregon Institute of Technology in 2007. He currently educates on the Insomnia at the Nationally Accredited Sleep Disorders Center. I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today our guest, Mr. Michael Schwartz. Michael, thank you for joining us here on the program today.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Now, I understand you've got quite an extensive background. How did you become interested in helping people sleep better?
Well, it started when I was in college as a psychology major, and I remember taking a course on sleep and finding it absolutely fascinating. And then after finishing my undergraduate degree, just being in an area, I was in Southern California, where there were many sleep disorder centers that were opening up. This was back in the mid-'80s. And one thing led to another, and I found myself recording the sleep of sleep disordered patients on big stainless steel polygraphs, and the whole thing was just fascinating to me.
Now, it's interesting because we live in a day and an age of technology where we're trying to find ways to help people who have trouble sleeping. Now, in America, how many people does this actually affect when it comes to not getting enough sleep?
Well, it depends on the type of sleep disorder you're talking about and some of the demographic breakdowns. But, you could probably roughly say 1 in 10 people suffer, a fairly moderate degree of problems sleeping, whether it's getting to sleep or staying asleep, or something going on while they're sleeping, such as breathing disorders or neuromuscular disorders.
Now, what are some of the things, I guess, call them side effects, besides just being tired, that people can actually experience when it comes to not getting enough sleep?
Well, there's a lot of research that's still ongoing, looking at metabolic disorders and looking at autoimmune disorders. Clearly, without adequate sleep, the body reacts. The body tries to cope, and that typically leads to chronic conditions of one sort or another. On the more acute side of things, acute sleep deprivation, for example, of course, leads to cognitive impairments and memory problems and things like that. So it's a whole host of problems that lack of sleep can cause.
Now, it's really interesting. I remember watching, I guess call it a small documentary. It was about sleep, but it was more involved with people who have those kind of jobs, for instance, truck drivers, airline pilots, and the like, and was showing how they would actually hook these people up in such a way where they could measure whether or not they were taking micro naps, so to speak. And it seemed pretty alarming to discover, here's a guy, at 20,000 feet, he's, flying your plane, and he's nodding off at the wheel, and that's, pretty interesting to see that things like that happen, and, what would be ways that people could actually balance it out so something like that didn't happen. But, of course, sitting in the cockpit of an airplane couldn't be too exciting on a long trip. But
Right. Well, those microsleeps you talk about are very well documented, and they're really just very brief moments of sleep, maybe 5, 10, 15 seconds, usually with the person not aware that they did briefly fall asleep into a very light transitional sleep, but nevertheless they were detached from their environment. And as you mentioned, if you're operating a large vehicle or somewhere that harm can really happen, if that occurs, then that's a problem. And And so those people need to really make sure they're getting adequate sleep at night. And if they feel like they're getting adequate sleep as far as how much time they're giving themselves, then they might look into what's going on while they sleep, which can be one of the sleep disorders like sleep apnea.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about some of the sleep disorders that are pretty common out there.
Yeah, as far as just across the general public, probably the most common sleep disorder, if you want to call it a disorder, is simply inadequate sleep time. People are depriving themselves a lot of times now through technology and social media and just the availability of communication 24/7 is really wreaking havoc on adequate sleep. From there, that's not really a sleep disorder per se, but you could think of it as one. So other than sleep deprivation, there would be something like insomnia disorders, maybe a psychophysiologic insomnia, people having trouble getting to sleep and staying asleep, waking up early and not being able to return to sleep, these types of problems. Probably next on the list would be the breathing disorders that we commonly refer to as sleep apnea, and that can run a whole spectrum from simple snoring all the way up to pauses in breathing lasting, up to 2 minutes or so, with all the cardiopulmonary consequences of that on a nightly basis. And then after sleep apnea, restless legs are pretty common. They have kind of a sister disorder that we see at night called periodic limb movements in sleep, and they tend to go hand in hand. Those can be disruptive to sleep, but sometimes not. And as far as these sleep disorders, a sleep disorder center offers the most comprehensive type of testing. We call it polysomnography, which can clearly get a handle on the degree of sleep apnea or the degree of leg movements, or even rare conditions that we see once in a while, like narcolepsy, which is a fascinating disorder.
It's interesting, too, the ways that you see advertised to help with these things. Now, again, as I mentioned earlier in the program, you have nearly 3 decades of experience in this area here. With what you've seen out there, what would you say really seems to work for some of these things you just discussed, or things that, maybe they work for some, but for the most part they're not as effective as they claim?
Well, it's kind of a brave new world out there with treating sleep disorders. You have to be very careful and ask a lot of questions and make sure you're talking to people who really understand sleep. But as far as, I kind of go down the list that I mentioned before, sleep deprivation, of course, the quote-unquote cure is to just get enough sleep. And that's typically a lifestyle choice of one sort or another, maybe a work schedule, maybe a caregiving schedule. But there's no medical cure for sleep deprivation. You just have to put sleep a little higher up on the priority list and get adequate sleep so you don't have those microsleeps during the day and things like that. As far as insomnias, that's a big category, the term itself. But if it's, some people have increased anxiety, so sometimes working on that side of things helps their sleep. Sometimes it's depression, and that's often associated with early morning awakenings and not being able to get back to sleep. And then there's a standard set of instructions really for insomnia that should be tried by anyone who's chronically struggling with insomnia, and we call that cognitive behavioral therapy. And there are people that are trained who can offer this type of guidance, and involves simple things from sleep hygiene instructions like don't have coffee in the afternoon or evening, avoid alcohol, these types of things, get enough exercise, to more regimented instructions like sleep restriction, where you reduce the time the person spends in bed for a period of time, and that drives up their quality of their sleep. You do that for maybe a week, and then if their quality starts going up, then you increase their time in bed to allow them to get adequate sleep. So these types of behavioral treatments, if you will, have been shown to be very effective. And then you can add some of the cognitive instructions as well, addressing some of the anxieties or misperceptions about sleep, and just kind of clarifying what sleep is and what are realistic expectations about sleep. Mm-hmm. And then from there, in the sleep apnea world, we have simple things can help, such as a little bit of weight loss, avoiding alcohol at bedtime, sleeping in the side position as opposed to on your back, because when we sleep on our back, the airway occludes or blocks off to a greater degree. And if those simple instructions don't seem to help, then there's positive airway pressure, sometimes called CPAP, which can be applied, which is a mask you wear over your nose with some air blowing into it, which splints your upper airway and allows you to breathe in an unobstructed way during the night. Also oral devices, which dentists can make for people who have mild sleep apnea, and it advances the jaw a bit to keep that airway open during sleep. And then there are treatments for the leg movements, which can get a little bit complicated. Clearly, these are medical conditions that need pharmacological treatments typically. Dopamine agonists and things like that can sometimes help. And for narcolepsy, you get into stimulants and you get into medications which reduce what's called cataplexy, which is a sudden momentary loss of muscle tone that narcoleptics often experience. So these medications try to help keep them alert during the day and reduce the severity of some of these other symptoms that go along with narcolepsy.
Mm-hmm. You know, it's interesting that you mentioned alcohol. Apparently, there are a lot of people that feel that having a nightcap there is a good thing before going to sleep, but you say, well, no. And I know personally, if I've been out and I've had some drinks and I find myself coming home, you get the slight buzz, whatever the case is, and you go to bed, you really don't sleep as well as you think you do. You might kind of go up. The fact is you're kind of agitated and tossing and turning. You're just not always aware of that through the course of the night, so you really don't sleep. And I find that when I don't have any alcohol, that I tend to sleep very nice and relaxed. I mean, you know, there's really a difference.
Yes, there is, and you're right on with your description of it. Alcohol is a central nervous system depressant, and when it's used in the evening, which is the most common time for people to ingest alcohol, it does suppress the central nervous system and does promote sleep. However, the type of sleep it promotes is a bit artificial, I guess is the best word to use. So it's sort of this artificial deep sleep that may go on for a couple hours, you know, into the night. But as you're sleeping, your body's metabolizing that alcohol, and it's really turning it into a sugar, which is a stimulant. So later in the night, a person who has ingested moderate to heavy amounts of alcohol would typically have very fragmented sleep, restless sleep, that also coincides with the onset of most of the REM sleep that we get during the night, which is in the latter part of the night. So it's really not a night cap. It's kind of a misnomer. It's more of an evening cap. You know, it's kind of caps your evening, but then it's the start of your night. You're gonna have a rough night if there's a lot of alcohol on board.
Yes, there's no doubt about that. That's for sure. And I know there was also, as I was on a website here, and I believe it's yours, it's the SleepQ, which we're going to talk about here in a minute. That you talk about another way that you can help people called Intensive Sleep Retraining. Now, that's interesting. It's not something I've heard of before.
Right, and it's not something that's widely available, so it's probably why you've never heard of it. But it's really a fascinating technique that was studied down in Australia at Flinders University, and there's a group down there that's continuing to look at that. And intensive sleep retraining is for the type of person who has chronic insomnia, where they're just, frequently have trouble getting to sleep. They wake up in the middle of the night. They have trouble getting back to sleep. These sorts of patterns. And as I mentioned before, there's this therapy called cognitive behavioral therapy, which addresses these types of problems. But the problem with cognitive behavioral therapy is it can take a while to work, and it also is not widely available. And so these researchers said, well, let's try to come up with something that works rapidly like sleeping pills do, but has no side effects and is safer and more long, or at least as long lasting as cognitive behavioral therapy. And so what they did is they said, okay, let's take some insomniacs, and they put it into different groups. And for one of the groups, what they had them do was they had them come into a sleep lab at bedtime after depriving themselves a bit of sleep the night before at home. So they come in pretty sleepy at bedtime. And they put some of the EEG wires that are very standard. And for the next 24 hours, they had them take a short nap or give them a short opportunity to sleep, about 20 minutes. And if the person who has insomnia, if they did fall asleep, the technician went in and asked them, do you think you just fell asleep? And the person would have to answer yes or no. And then they were given the correct answer right there. So they had immediate feedback as to whether they fell asleep or not. And if they did not fall asleep, the same thing. The technician went in, asked if they fell asleep, got the answer, told them, no, you did not. And so what happened over these 24 hours, which is really bedtime to bedtime, the person's normal sleep drive obviously increased during that time because they were not allowed to sleep very long, but their awareness of their sleep really improved. And these people got very good at detecting if they fell asleep or not, as well as their ability to fall asleep went up. So it was a very positive experience. It was a bit punitive, but it was very positive as far as how well they did. And then their ability to sleep, their improved ability to sleep, was shown to last for months and months. I think they looked at up to 9 months or a year, something like that. And it was working basically as well as cognitive behavioral therapy, but it was very onset. So it was a very rapid procedure, unlike cognitive behavioral therapy, which can take a number of weeks to really start to work. So that's the whole idea of intensive sleep retraining, and it's a fascinating technique, and I think we're going to hear more about it.
It's really a fascinating thing because I wanted you to talk about that because it reminded me of a time that I went to try a particular modality known as bioneurotherapy. And it's really interesting how they hook you up with the little electrodes on your head, and then, for instance, you look at a computer, and for about 8 minutes you have to keep this bar down as low as you can, So you're kind of in touch with how your mind works and that sort of a thing. And what I was describing to the person that I was working with, and I said, I've been a lucid dreamer since I was about 5 or 6 years old, not as regularly as a child, but as I got older, I started working with it more. And she says, that's really good because then you know how your mind works a lot better. So this will really work well for you. But there were moments because I would actually have to track across town, generally after work, So generally when you settle down after work, you tend to kind of feel that need to nap, nod off, nap, whatever the case is. So here you're sitting in this quiet office, and you're hooked up to this thing, and it has its little sound effects that you're hearing in the earplugs, but for the most part, it's quiet. So I'm trying to keep this bar low, and then I'd find myself at times getting into that deep realm that you would feel asleep and then actually knowing that I was going to sleep at the same time. So there would be a point where she would come in after that and she would take a look at the brainwaves and say, okay, now what happened here? And I could say, well, that was a moment that I nodded off, and I knew that. And so that's why I wanted you to talk about that fact that people come to know when they're sleeping and even to the point how long they actually feel that they've been asleep. So it's pretty interesting.
Right. And there really is a big discrepancy in a person's estimation of how long they took to fall asleep and how long they slept for the whole night, especially if you remove any indication of time clocks, watches, and things like that. That discrepancy, that misperception, is greatly enhanced in someone who has chronic insomnia. I mean, literally, they'll say, "Oh, I didn't sleep at all last night," and maybe we have a motion sensor they wear on their wrist or something which showed maybe they did sleep for 3-4 hours, but they didn't perceive it. And so the intensive sleep retraining procedure is meant to really address that misperception. And where a lot of the people who've gone through it, they report that they relearn the mechanics of getting to sleep. And it's kind of a general phrase, but it really kind of rings true. These people tend to forget what it feels like to fall asleep. The misperception gets so enhanced.
You know, Michael, it's so interesting to be talking about this area of sleep that we are right now, because it isn't something you commonly hear on a television program or maybe a radio segment, whatever the case is, and that is the perception of time and sleep. And it's really a fascinating area, because I would find there were times, and time's really interesting, it almost exists in its own way, well, when it comes to sleep. So, but to give you an idea, for instance, there'd be those times that you might fall asleep and you think, there goes the alarm, and it feels like you just hit the pillow 10 minutes ago, but you know that you went to bed 6 or 7 hours ago. Mm-hmm. And then there were times that I've literally experienced this, and when it happens, I know, and I start smiling knowing that this is about to happen. But here's the deal. I'll wake up and realize, well, you know, I've got about an hour and a half, 2 hours before I have to get to work, so I'm going to go ahead, you know, lay down and go back to sleep again. So I'd go back to sleep, and the next thing you know, I feel like I'm in these series of dreams that feels like they just go on forever. Then I wake up, and it's only been 4 or 5 minutes that I've been asleep, but it feels like I've been asleep for hours mentally. And why I say I smile about that is because I realize now that I'm going to go back to sleep again, and I'm going to experience the same thing, but for the next 2 hours, I get to stretch it out for what feels to be days. And so when I wake up, I feel very refreshed, and it's fascinating to talk about that time-sleep perception, you know. And what has your study shown where, I'll bet that's kind of fascinated you as well, I would think.
Yes, it really does, because it's so such a salient point when you're working with someone who has chronic insomnia. The whole time perception is just, it's really skewed, and it's really fascinating to look at people's perceptions, their estimations. Maybe they fill out a sleep log or something like that, and they're tracking these things. And then you look at a little more objective information, such as the motion sensor that they wear on their wrist, and it can. I mean, I've had patients literally, you know, look straight at me and say, I don't believe the sensor you put on my wrist. It doesn't work. And I say, well, it's, you know, it's FDA validated, and it's.
Well, it's a good thing we don't have you behind the wheel of a moving automobile.
Yes, exactly right. Exactly right.
You're going to know that you fell asleep one way or the other.
Right. Well, that, you know, the whole it's a couple things. One is when you're describing your dreams. Part of that is again how the REM, which is when our dreams mostly occur, the vivid dreams, anyways, is mostly temporally stays towards, you know, the latter part of the night. So people who wake up early often will report they were dreaming, or if they go back to sleep for a while, they report vivid dreams, because your brain is really kind of in dream mode for that last hour or two of the night, which is really morning if you think about it for most people. But that's the perception of time during REM sleep that you've experienced is even more skewed, and the whole study is fascinating, you know, the perception of time and dreams. But I also want to point out one simple thing, you know, if you want to just throw out a simple suggestion, because people ask me, what do you suggest for sleep? And one of the best things you can do is really not be aware of the time during the night. Mm-hmm. And that can be simply turning your clock around, or taking your wristwatch off, or not checking your smartphone, these types of things. I think, you know, if you set your alarm for morning, you don't have to look at your alarm for it to wake you up. You know, it wakes you up by sound. And so just not knowing what time it is during the night can be a very, very helpful thing for someone who struggles with chronic insomnia.
Mm-hmm. You know, there's another point, too. For instance, when it comes to alarm clocks, I honestly haven't used an alarm clock. Oh, my goodness. It seems decades almost. And it's interesting, especially for my wife, if there's a time that we have to get up early in the morning. You know, I tend to, personally, and maybe we can address this in a bit, I really prefer sleeping between, let's say, 4 in the morning until about, 11 or noon. For me, it just feels so peaceful, so quiet, and so relaxed during that time of day versus, at night when people typically go to sleep. And, typically my challenge is if I go to bed before midnight, which is rare, But then I find myself waking up before midnight. I'll find myself laying there until about 5 in the morning wondering when am I going to get to sleep. So anyway, that being said, going back to having to get up, she would say, well, are you sure that we're going to get up at 5:30 in the morning or 6 o'clock in the morning? And yeah, that's just fine. And she says, without an alarm? And I said, yeah, without a doubt, you're going to be awake. I'll be up at that time. And I can do this. It's almost as though a perception has been created in such a way that you can wake up without alarm, and I have never really failed to wake up when I'm supposed to get up to get ready to go do whatever we need to do.
Okay, yeah. You hear reports like that, and my feeling is that people are just different in that awareness of time. Mm-hmm. Some people just seem to be able to, they report frequently waking up, a minute before their alarm goes off or something like that. Mm-hmm. I don't really know what the explanation is. Getting to the sleep schedule that you mentioned, feeling like going to bed, late at night or even kind of early morning and sleeping till later in the morning, but that's more of we call it larks and owls. You sound like you're more of an owl than a lark. And,
born at 7:30 at night, and I've been a night person pretty much ever since. But
yeah, and most people describe that. They say, "Oh, most of my life I've had trouble getting to sleep, or I fall asleep, easily and early, and I get up early, and I've just always been that way." And that's just normal human variation. But another factor, though, is with the exponential increase of technology in the evening, is that we're exposing ourselves to a lot of backlit screen light, and backlit screens, whether it's a phone or a computer or TV, is putting out a lot of blue spectrum light, which tends to shut down our melatonin, or at least disrupt our melatonin at night, which can then make it difficult to get to sleep. So for people who don't have the ability through their work schedule or family schedule to sleep late into the morning, that can be very problematic. And so they really need to be very judicious and watch that screen time at night and try to get the screens off a little earlier.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no televisions in my bedroom. It's against the law. My parents, they do that. They've got one in their living room, and then they've got one in their bedroom, and I'm thinking to myself, that was two things that I got to a point I just didn't do too much anymore. A, never have a television in your bedroom. And then the second thing, I remember, like, even my brothers would listen to music until they fell asleep, and there were times that I did that, but generally, I just like it quiet. And I think, to me, it seems that you're better overall, because I would think with those outside stimuluses going on, it's keeping your brain awake, and that's not really the goal when it comes to going to bed, is it?
That's exactly right. Mm-hmm. The human brain functions, it's designed to function on analog activity. And in the evening, it really boils down to avoiding screens and getting the brain involved in analog activities as the evening goes on. Is that whole process is a natural process, so that tapering light and reading as opposed to watching TV or using the computer, or even listening to an audio story is a great thing for the brain to promote the onset of sleep. So with technology, it gets difficult because these backlit screens aren't just emitting light; they're sometimes emitting all of the information known to the world. You're in the palm of your hand. You have the answer to any question you've ever come up with, and that's not really a great thing for the brain in the evening as you're hoping sleep, is approaching. So reading is great because it distracts you. It's a story. It takes your mind somewhere else, and getting the mind away from the present situation is one of the best things you can do for your sleep. And the sleepiness is a passive act. You fall asleep, it's passive. You can't force yourself. One of the first things I tell people, you can't force sleep. And as soon as you start to try, that's when problems emerge. And reading is one of the best things to prevent yourself from trying to sleep.
Mm-hmm. Michael, I'm really glad that you said that, because you would typically hear out there general consensus saying that reading before you go to sleep isn't such a good thing, but I always found it to be a great thing to do. Not that I do it all the time, but when I did, it just was always very enjoyable.
I think that it's one of the best things that you can do. Considering options of TV and computer,
Absolutely.
a better option.
Right. Now, go ahead.
I was just going to say, reading is it's a very natural thing for for humans to do. Even journaling, getting things off your mind, all these analog type activities are just really what sets the brain into motion for sleep. It gets the cortisol levels down, it gets melatonin going, and it's just a natural process that people need.
Mm-hmm. Now, one thing I'd like to address, too, that you see so common out there is how much sleep is good for us. And I know there seems to be a few schools of thought, but generally it's 8 hours a day or maybe 10 hours a day, or some even say 4. And as you were saying earlier, as we were talking about that time-sleep perception, that everybody seems to be a little bit different. So these statements of, well, one size is good for everybody, and these are the hours you really should be sleeping and why, you kind of sit there confused and you think, well, I'm talking with a guy here with more about 3 decades of experience with sleep, versus what I'm hearing here from somebody who has a basic knowledge of it but is rendering this advice that we should all follow.
Right. As far as how much sleep you need, it's kind of a big question, common question. The short answer is you need enough sleep to feel like you're functioning reasonably well during the day. And
I like that.
If you ask, you ask your doctor, your practitioner, anyone watching your health, that is the answer you're going to get if they really understand sleep.
Right.
There's a danger in giving someone a number. It's sort of like, how many calories should you eat? You get hung up on a number, you kind of set yourself up for failure a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
If you can instead approach the question in a more lifestyle type of answer, then it's a little more tangible. A person can feel like they can work with it a little bit. With sleep, it's important to remember that sleep and wake are, they're intertwined. When you fall asleep, it's not like you become a completely different person, unaffected by anything that's happened in the last 18 hours. It's the yin and yang. It's what happens during the day affects your sleep. What happens while you sleep, or I should say, the quality of your sleep affects your day. And so it's going to vary. It's the human experience. Every day is different, and so every night's going to be different. So to get hung up on a number is really kind of setting yourself up for some failure. You really want to make sure people know that it's going to vary. There's a lot of variability with sleep, and you just try to do the right things during the day as best you can, and then do the right things in the evening to prepare for sleep. And then there's even things in the middle of the night that can extend wakefulness during the night, and there's certain things that can be taught that reduces that amount of wakefulness at night.
Mm-hmm. It reminds me of a lady's comment on one of our YouTube interviews that had to do with high blood pressure. And she says, I really like the information, but one thing that worries me is that, what if I begin to listen to every interview there is on every part of my body? I might come to the point where, I feel like I'm not doing it right, I think was sort of the way she put it. And so I looked at this comment and I said, well, I can appreciate that. So my reply to this was, we live in a world today with so many experts telling us that, what we should be doing, that somehow they know inherently what's better for us than we do. And I said, it's time that we start taking more a 100% responsible approach to this, maybe looking toward the expert for advice if something, doesn't seem to be working our way, whatever it is, but to really count on the fact that you inherently know what the right thing for you to do is. As I was describing earlier, if I was to listen to that expert that I've seen on TV on one of these, big talk shows saying, well, ideally what you should be doing is going to bed at 10 o'clock at night and waking up around 7, I would say, well, that just doesn't work for me because these are the hours I prefer to sleep. As a result, I get up, I'm generally in a good mood, generally have the kind of energy I need to do for the kind of things that I need to do. And quite frankly, in that time frame, I'm averaging about 5 or 6 hours of sleep, give or take, sometimes more, sometimes a little less. But the bottom line is I went to sleep when I was tired, and I woke up when I was ready to get up and get out of bed. And this expert's trying to tell me, well, that might be all wrong, and I ain't buying it. And to me, it sounds like you're kind of supporting sort of, I guess, my philosophy when it comes to sleep. Sleep when you're tired, get up when you're ready to get up, and eat when you're hungry.
Yep, I'm 100% supporting that. I think, I like to think, you don't need a pill to get hungry. You don't need a pill to get sleepy. Your body will take care of that for you if you let it. Mm-hmm. And I think it's the if you let it part where people can kind of put some attention into what they're doing, into their behaviors. And, with sleep, it's kind of like you want to rule out anything organic, kind of obvious going on with your sleep, like, how do you sleep? Well, I wake up every night in the middle of the night. Okay, well, what's going on? Well, they tell you a few things. Oh, yeah, and my St. Bernard jumps up and down in my bed at 3 in the morning. And I'm thinking, okay, well, maybe that's something you could look at. I'm being kind of silly, but you get the idea.
No, we have a dog that does that, unfortunately. Or fortunately, he's not 200 pounds a dog. But
yeah, so, there's kind of simple things you want to look at, and when I work with patients, often they figure it out. They answer their own questions ultimately. Mm-hmm. I'm just kind of guiding them, trying to show them some of the more common things that people do that maybe affect their sleep adversely, and things that they can try that are fairly common. But it becomes very individualistic as you talk to someone and work with someone. Maybe they don't sleep in a bedroom that looks like it's in a catalog. Maybe they sleep in their car.
Right.
These types of things, they come out with conversation, and that's often what it takes, is a bit of that back and forth. What have you tried? What seems to work? Are you willing to try some different things and just see what happens? That cause and effect kind of idea really works well with sleep. But, having said all that, a good first place to start is talking to your primary practitioner, someone who knows your health, and say, is there anything going on? Like, am I anemic? Do I have thyroid issues? Or anything that can be kind of dealt with and addressed that can affect sleep? Because really, just about anything can affect your sleep. So once a person felt like, I've gone pretty far with my physical health, I've talked to my practitioner, things are pretty stable, I got a handle on things, but sleep is just difficult. Then we get the discussion going about specific sleep things.
Mm-hmm. And one thing, too, did you eat that big club sandwich just before you went to bed? Because, certainly eating a fair, sizable snack before you go to bed, well, that's not a great idea. And I only say that because then your body has to get to work digesting, which means that it's active, and there you go.
Right, yeah, and then you get indigestion and all of that. And yeah, you just want to be comfortable at bedtime as much as possible. Physically comfortable, you want to be in a comfortable environment, low stress, comfortable environment, and do things that allow natural sleepiness to really get strong in the evening, so that sleep kind of overwhelms you, so you don't ever feel like you're trying to fall asleep.
Mm-hmm. Michael, I'm kind of curious, because you've been doing this for as long as you have, for the listeners out there, for close to 30 years now, you've been involved in sleep and sleep research and helping people to sleep better. When you see these experts out there making the claims or the suggestions they do for us, are there some of them that kind of leave you chuckling, like, I can't believe that you've got a badge that says you're this expert and you're actually saying that?
Well, there are a number of, very, very knowledgeable, well-spoken experts on sleep that you'll find, and you'll find articles by them, and you'll see them interviewed, and I always wish they had more time. And whenever I see them, for example, on TV, or I hear a short clip on the radio,
right?
They get 45 seconds, and I'm thinking, this person knows so much about sleep. I'd really like to hear their opinion about a couple of other things. So there are many, many just amazing sleep experts out there, and I try to read as much as I can about what they publish. But then there are other claims, that other people make, and it might not be sleep primarily. It might be, a chemical that does, all these things to help you, and it's, and they throw in sleep, of course. It's like, of course, you're going to say it improves your sleep.
Like shark cartilage, for instance.
Yeah, or whatever it is, I mean,
right.
Anything, and for some people it will work and it will help their sleep, but there's no way you can show that kind of, try to hold some variables constant and look at it in a scientific manner. It doesn't hold up. So there's a lot of, kind of the psychological aspects of things that can improve sleep, but they tend not to last. That's the problem with, this or that new thing for sleep. It's like people try it and it solved all my problems, and then you talk to them, a year later, how's it working out? Oh, yeah, that stopped working or something. Mm-hmm. That's true with sleeping pills, too. A lot of them, they just lose their effectiveness, and that's a whole other discussion.
Mm-hmm. Now, ultimately, too, one more thing, an area that I think is important to discuss, is how different is sleep when you're young versus as you age?
Yeah, there are big changes. When we're born, we kind of go in and out of sleep frequently during the 24-hour cycle. And, the brain is just kind of getting things established, organizing itself. We tend to have actually quite a bit more of that REM dream sleep when we're young, and a lot of deep sleep. So the brain is kind of going through very big changes in its activity during sleep. And then as we move into, puberty years, things start to stabilize with our REM sleep. Kind of settles in around 20-25% of a typical night of sleep for a quote-unquote normal sleeper. It kind of gets established maybe in our teenage years. And that pretty much holds true for most of the rest of our life. Your deeper sleep, which actually is, interestingly happens more in the start of the night, that tends to kind of reach its peak around the teenage years, and then will gradually, very slowly decrease as we age. The deep sleep is more associated with growth hormone release and thought to be more physically restorative as opposed to mentally restorative like REM. And then, as we get into our working years, we tend to have a pretty stable schedule because we have a work schedule, and then people get Sunday night insomnia because they're up late on Friday and Saturday nights and sleeping in Saturday and Sunday mornings, and then Monday's there and they have work and they can't fall asleep, they're worried, and that whole idea is pretty common during the working years. And then later, after people retire, what I see a lot is people just want to, it's carpe diem, it's I'll just sleep whenever I want, and, have the extra martini at night, and I'll take naps and everything, and works for a little while for some people, but then a lot of people, they start to just struggle with sleep. They get off a rhythm. We have this natural circadian rhythm, and sometimes after we are done with our working life, that rhythm tends to get a little bit elusive because of our behaviors. And then later in life, our sleep becomes sometimes polyphasic again, kind of like when we're very, very young infants and young toddlers, where they're sleeping awake multiple times during a 24-hour period. That can return in our elderly years. And for some elderly folks, just knowing that, just understanding that pattern is fairly natural, can really put them at ease, and then they stop complaining about their sleep. So that's always kind of a rewarding thing when you help someone who's in their elderly years really come to terms with, what normal sleep is for that age.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Also fascinating. What an interesting subject. Now, I know that we talked about technology, and in some ways technology can deprive you of sleep, but you happen to use technology to come up with known as a SleepQ app. Tell us about that.
Yeah, kind of ironic. I've been kind of bashing technology.
I don't know that you've been bashing it. What you've been saying, for instance, I think a TV in a bedroom is just something, for me personally, that just too agitating,
Yeah.
Or playing that music in the background. Sometimes that can be a good thing, and sometimes it isn't. It just really depends. But you're right, because we get so distracted. For instance, when you see these iPhones now with people using them, they're constantly on this, and they're constantly hitting that with a thumb. It's almost like somebody who's in the hospital trying to get that extra shot of morphine. If they just keep pressing the button, that instant gratification, that can't really be good for the mind to get to a point to really settle down, so to speak. So that's the way I think that you were really talking about technology and how it can kind of, disrupt your sleep and your sleep patterns. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. technology, first and foremost, it's a tool. It's a tool to help.
Michael, I was going to say, as you answer this question, you're sounding a little muffled back there, and you were clear there before, so we don't know if the St. Bernard jumped in the mouthpiece there. Or, there we go.
Let's see.
Oh, there you go. You're sounding a lot better now. So.
Okay.
Because I really wanted people to hear this.
Yeah. Technology really is a tool, and it can help us, obviously, in amazing ways. You can not go on about that, but with the advent of these applications on smartphone devices, it's opened up this whole world of recording sleep. Mm-hmm. And recording sleep is done with a smartphone. It's done through movement detection. Phones have accelerometers in them, and the accelerometer detects movement, and then movement can be turned into an estimation of sleep and wake patterns. So you'll have smartphone apps that you can put under your pillow, or you wear a device on your wrist, and it when you move, it talks to your phone, which is next to you, kind of a Bluetooth thing. And the whole idea is just exploded, and people now can track their sleep, or at least get an estimation of their sleep. And that can be helpful when used, judiciously. It's an estimation of sleep. It's an indirect measurement of sleep. But the idea that there's a device in a phone, an accelerometer that detects movement, is really what led me to develop the SleepQ app, which is using that accelerometer in a very different way. It's used for movement detection in an active way as opposed to a passive way. And if you'd like, I could tell you about the SleepQ app at this point.
Yes, please.
So the SleepQ app I developed that after reading about the research on intensive sleep retraining to help people with chronic insomnia. And I wanted to mimic that laboratory method that they use. Because, the research concluded essentially with sleep experts, a couple of real well-known sleep experts, Dr. Spielman and Golvinsky, where they essentially called for an at-home version of this procedure. They said, this is really good stuff, and there should be a way to do this at home in an affordable way. And so I kind of was thinking about it, and I went through some different iterations of what this might be, and I settled on the idea of a call and response method for detecting sleep. And we've known for decades that as you fall asleep, your response to sounds decreases, or you could say your auditory threshold goes up as you move into sleep. I call it the response, where your wife's reading you something as you're, in bed falling asleep, and you keep going, and then the kind of stop.
Right.
You stop responding to this auditory input. So what the SleepQ app is, in order to mimic the whole procedure of intensive sleep retraining with this repeated opportunities to fall asleep over and over again, the phone emits a tone, a very faint tone, and the user simply responds by giving the phone a slight shake. And by doing that, if shakes, if the responses are missed, if the tones are not responded to, then the phone or the app says, okay, this person is now asleep. And, I laugh to torture the person, then it wakes them up. It vibrates. And so that repeated, falling asleep using this call and response method and then immediately waking the user up is the process of intensive sleep retraining. After each time the phone wakes the person up, the phone asks the person, do you think you fell asleep? And then the user simply responds, yes or no. And then the phone, like the research that was done, the phone prompts the user to leave the bed for a few minutes and then come back to bed and repeat the process again. And this is all done at the start of the night around bedtime, when natural sleepiness is, starting to increase. And it's sort of like training. It's almost like exercise training, where you can do it as long as you want. Often I recommend users start off with maybe an hour, hour and a half around bedtime and just kind of see how it goes and just learn the process. And then after any rough night of sleep, they can do this again the following night around bedtime. And it helps with, again, learning the mechanics of falling asleep, you're getting feedback. Now the app is giving you feedback instead of the technician. And it's asking if you think you fell asleep, and the phone, of course, knows if you fell asleep or not. So it immediately gives you the correct answer, and you learn. And that learning what it feels like to fall asleep was described in the Intensive Sleep Retraining research by that group in Australia. And so that app it's an interesting app, and I love telling people about it. And I've actually also been in contact with this research group in Australia, and they have ideas for using it, as well as in other research that they're doing where they're looking at the optimal duration of naps during the day. And the iPhone app that I created, the SleepQ app, has a napping module. So you can dial in how long you have for your nap and how long you actually want to sleep, because the app can detect the onset of sleep. So it can kind of use that to help you take just the correct duration of nap.
Fascinating stuff. Definitely, this is one of those wonderful subjects, like you were saying. There isn't a whole lot of time really being given to something like this, and there are so many interesting questions, and I think, the biggest one is, what is the right thing about sleep? And as we've been discussing, it's really individual, but certainly take a look at going to an expert if you just find that things aren't working out for you, and what kind of things are available. And it sounds like SleepQ app is one of those fascinating things that can actually help someone. And, there's not too many people anymore without an iPhone, so there's no reason not to have it.
Right, yeah. We're actually talking about doing an Android version as well, so hopefully that will be in the works soon. And I've had a lot of requests for that.
Mm-hmm. Well, Michael, thank you so much for joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program. Why don't you go ahead and give out a website where people can explore more about what we're talking about here today?
Sure. The website is sleeponq.com, and that's sleep on and the letter Q.com. And at the website, you can see a description of the app. There's a link to the App Store right there. I have information about sleep in general. I have information about different workshops that I'm starting to give, and the dates and locations of those. I have information, what else is on there? Like an FAQ page just about sleep and about the SleepQ app. I also do, sometimes I'll do Skype calls with people who are struggling with their sleep. They've received information from their their medical provider about what they can do, and they don't quite know how to implement it. So I just try to be a resource to help people with sleep problems of any kind, mainly focusing on the good, solid, tried and true behaviors, and my own variation of those behaviors, my own way of describing them or helping people implement them, I think is what sets me apart a bit from others. So I'm always happy to reply with emails. You can contact me through the webpage. And again, that's sleeponq, the letter Q.com.
So SleepOnQ will provide answers that you're looking for, at least get you to ask the right questions so you can find the answers of how you can get a better night's rest. Michael, thank you so much for joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program. It's been a real pleasure.
Great. I appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
You bet. We want to thank you, the listeners out there. Hopefully you have been nodding off and you've been awake so you can figure out how you can sleep a lot better. You can also discover more at beyond50radio.com. That is the number 50. And also follow us on Twitter at Beyond50Radio. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for tuning in. This is the Beyond 50 radio program. And remember, live your day past halfway.